In the 19th century, Europe was obsessed with classification, not just of animals, not just of plants, but of people. Everything had to be measured, catalogued, placed into neat hierarchies that made the world feel controlled. Skulls were weighed, noses were measured, skin tones were compared under gaslight lamps by men who called themselves scientists. They believed humanity could be arranged the way insects were pinned to boards. And at the very top of that imagined hierarchy stood Europe itself, civilized, advanced, superior. This belief was not whispered. It was taught in universities, printed in textbooks, displayed in museums, and eventually it was displayed in zoos. The birth of racial science. By the mid-1800s, a dangerous idea had taken hold across Europe, that some humans were less evolved than others. This was not folklore, it was not superstition, it was presented as fact. Men like Georges Cuvier and later anthropologists spoke of primitive races as if they were frozen in time, living fossils meant to show Europeans what humanity once was. They argued that Africans, indigenous peoples, and colonized populations were closer to nature, closer to animals, closer to instinct, and therefore closer to being observed, studied, displayed. When curiosity became entertainment. At first, exhibitions were framed as educational. Ethnographic villages, colonial showcases, cultural demonstrations. Entire fake villages were constructed in Paris, Brussels, London, and Berlin. Visitors would walk past enclosures and gaze at living people performing daily life, cooking, dancing, sitting, existing. They were told this was science. They were told this was progress. They were never told the people inside had no choice. Children laughed, adults pointed, newspapers praised the realism, and the line between museum and zoo began to disappear. Belgium and the illusion of innocence. Belgium at the time liked to think of itself as enlightened, small, civilized, neutral. But behind that image was an empire built on brutality. King Leopold II ruled the Congo Free State as his personal property, not a colony, a possession. Millions died extracting rubber and ivory for European markets. Hands were severed, families were destroyed, villages erased. And yet, back in Belgium, this violence was invisible. Or rather, it was repackaged. The role of zoos in colonial power. Zoos were no longer just places for animals. They became symbols of dominance. If Europe could cage the wild beasts of the world, why not the people it had conquered? Human exhibits were presented as proof of empire's reach. Look how far we have gone, they said. Look what we have discovered. The Antwerp Zoo, founded in 1843, was among Europe's most respected institutions. Scientific, reputable, family-friendly, which made what happened there even more disturbing, because no one questioned it. The moral silence. Pastors attended these exhibits. Teachers brought students. Doctors took notes. There were no protests, no public outrage, because the people inside the enclosures were not seen as equals. They were exhibits, and exhibits do not suffer. At least, that's what Europe told itself. The dangerous comfort of distance. Most visitors never thought about where these people came from. They didn't ask how long the journey took. They didn't ask what happened when the exhibit closed. They saw costumes, not individuals. They saw behavior, not fear. And this distance made cruelty effortless. Because when someone is framed as other, empathy becomes optional. The foundation is set. By the time the Antwerp Zoo prepared its human exhibitions, the groundwork was already laid. The public was conditioned. The science was settled. The empire demanded proof of its greatness. All that remained was to bring the people in and put up the fences. Because once a fence exists, humanity is easy to forget.
The children in the enclosures. The ships arrived quietly. No crowds gathered at the docks. No ceremonies were held. The people brought ashore were not welcomed as guests. They were unloaded. Families from the Congo, men, women, and children, were transported across oceans they did not understand, to cities they had never heard of, for reasons they were never fully told. Some believed they were traveling for work. Others were told they would represent their homeland. A few were promised protection, food, and shelter. None were told they would be watched constantly. The first fence. When they arrived in Antwerp, the zoo was already prepared. The enclosure was clean, deliberate, designed to look authentic. Artificial huts were constructed to resemble African villages. Paths were laid so visitors could circle the enclosure from every angle. There were no locks on the gates, because escape was never considered. The city beyond the fence was foreign. The language was unknown. The cold was unbearable, and guards were always nearby. Children learn quickly. Children adapt faster than adults. They learn the rules without needing them explained. They learned when to sit, when to stand, when to perform. They learned that laughter from outside the fence meant they were being watched. They learned that silence attracted fewer eyes. Some children stopped speaking altogether. Others mimicked what the visitors expected: gestures, dances, movements exaggerated into caricature. Not because they wanted to, but because attention could mean food, or warmth, or being left alone. Sickness as a spectacle. European winters were brutal to bodies that had never known such cold. Children fell ill quickly. Coughs echoed inside the huts at night. Fevers burned unchecked. Medical care was minimal. After all, the exhibit had to remain natural. Illness was seen as an inconvenience. Death was seen as inevitable. When a child died, the exhibit did not close. The fence remained open. The crowds continued to arrive. Sometimes the body was removed before opening hours. Sometimes it wasn't. Names replaced by descriptions. Official records rarely mention names. Instead, they describe male child, female infant, Congolese youth. Ages were estimated. Causes of death were simplified. Exposure, weak constitution, natural causes. As if being placed in a cage thousands of miles from home was a natural condition. Parents were rarely consulted. Grief was inconvenient. Mothers behind glass. Mothers were expected to continue performing even while mourning. Visitors wanted to see daily life, cooking, childcare, rituals. Grief disrupted the narrative. Some women were instructed to smile. Others were ignored entirely. One mother reportedly carried her child's body for hours before it was taken away because no one had told her what to do. There was no protocol for love. Education through dehumanization. Schools organized visits. Teachers encouraged students to observe, to compare, to learn. Children learned that some lives were objects of study, that some suffering was acceptable, that empathy had limits. This lesson lasted far longer than the exhibit itself. The illusion of consent. Later records would claim participation was voluntary, that families agreed, that contracts existed. But consent under coercion is not consent. When survival depends on obedience, choice disappears, and children never chose. They were born into an enclosure or brought into one. The silence after dark. When the zoo closed for the night, the city fell quiet. But inside the enclosure, fear remained. Children cried softly to avoid attention. Parents whispered stories of home, stories that grew harder to remember. The smell of the earth was wrong. The sky looked unfamiliar, and the fence did not disappear in the dark. It loomed, a reminder that they were not visitors. They were exhibits. A generation without records. Some children survived. What happened to them afterward is mostly unknown. They do not appear in census records. They do not appear in employment rolls. They vanish, absorbed into labor, returned without documentation, or forgotten entirely. History did not preserve their voices, only their confinement. Children are often called the future, but here they were proof. Proof that cruelty could be normalized. Proof that innocence offered no protection.
The Antwerp Zoo Human Display. The Antwerp Zoo did not improvise. Every detail of the human exhibit was planned, measured, approved. This was not chaos, it was administration. The layout of control. The enclosure was placed deliberately along a main walking path. Visitors did not need to search for it. They would arrive naturally, following signs meant for animals. The fence was low enough to see over, high enough to prevent contact, wide enough to suggest separation. Inside, artificial huts were arranged in a semicircle. Each one faced outward, toward the audience. Privacy was not part of the design. Scheduled humanity. Life inside the enclosure followed a timetable. Morning, waking, cleaning, preparation. Midday, demonstrations, movement, activity. Afternoon, peak attendance. Evening, silence. Nothing was spontaneous. Even rest was visible. People were watched while they ate, watched while they slept, watched while they did nothing at all. Doing nothing was still part of the exhibit. Clothing as costume. The people inside were dressed according to expectation, not comfort. Traditional clothing was selected for visibility.
bright colors, exposed skin, anything that reinforced difference. Cold weather was ignored. Blankets disrupted the image. Shoes made them look too similar, so discomfort became part of the performance. The audience saw authenticity. The subjects felt pain. The gaze. Visitors leaned forward, pointed, commented freely. They spoke as if no one could hear them, as if the people inside were deaf or incapable of understanding. Some mimicked movements, others laughed, a few threw coins. Food was occasionally tossed, not as kindness, as interaction. Photography without permission. Cameras were common, tripods set up directly against the fence. Photographs were taken from above, from below, from every angle. Postcards were printed, images were sold. The same faces repeated across Europe, frozen in compliance. They were not asked, they were documented. The illusion of performance. At times, the people inside were instructed to demonstrate culture, cooking methods, music, dance. These were not celebrations, they were reenactments under pressure. Repetition stripped meaning away. Culture became routine, routine became exhaustion, exhaustion became silence. Children as attractions. Children drew the most attention. They were smaller, easier to observe, less threatening. Visitors commented on their size, their expressions, their movements. Children learned quickly when to smile, when not to react, when to disappear into corners. Some stood very still. Stillness reduced attention. No escape in plain sight. The gates were unlocked. This was intentional. It created the illusion of freedom, but freedom requires options, and there were none. Language barriers, financial dependence, social isolation, surveillance. Even if someone walked out, where would they go? The fence was psychological and far stronger than iron. Zoo staff and indifference. Zoo employees maintained the exhibit like any other. Cleaning schedules, feeding times, medical inspections. No emotional engagement, no personal names, just responsibilities. This distance made cruelty sustainable. No one felt responsible. They were simply doing their job. Normalization. After weeks, the exhibit became routine. Visitors passed by casually. Children pulled their parents along. The novelty faded, which made it worse, because once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible, and invisible cruelty lasts the longest. A single day inside the enclosure. Morning light filters through the slats. A child wakes up coughing. A woman stares at the fence without moving. A man repairs the same broken tool he repaired yesterday. The bell rings. People gather. Eyes press forward. Voices overlap. The day repeats. No beginning, no end, just observation. The Antwerp Zoo did not hide this. That is the most important thing to remember. They were not ashamed, because shame requires recognition, and recognition requires seeing people as human.
Photographed, catalogued, forgotten. The fence did not end the exhibition. It merely framed it. What truly preserved the horror was paper and glass plates and ink. The camera as authority. Photography in the late 19th century was not casual, it was scientific. A camera did not merely capture an image, it declared truth.
When a photograph was taken, it became evidence. And so the people inside the Antwerp Zoo enclosure were photographed relentlessly, standing, sitting, facing forward, facing sideways, measured poses, neutral expressions, sometimes instructed, sometimes forced. The purpose was not memory, it was classification. Faces without context. The photographs were stripped of names. Instead, captions were added. Congolese male, native woman with child, primitive family group. No ages, no histories, no voices, just categories. The camera flattened them into examples, not individuals. Postcards of living people. Many of these photographs were printed and sold. Postcards, souvenirs, taken home, sent across borders, pinned to walls, written on. "I saw this today," someone might have written. "Very interesting." The people in the image would never read those words. They would never know where their faces traveled. They would never know how long they would be looked at. Measurement as justification. Photography was only the beginning. Anthropologists arrived with tools, calipers, measuring tapes, notebooks. They measured skulls, arms, legs, noses. They recorded proportions, angles, ratios. Every measurement was used to reinforce a conclusion already decided, that these people were lesser, that the exhibit was necessary, that observation was progress. The language of distance. In the reports, the language was detached, polite, scientific, words like specimen, subject, type. Emotion was absent, suffering was irrelevant. If illness appeared, it was documented. If death occurred, it was noted, but never mourned, because data does not grieve. When children became data. Children were especially valuable to researchers. They represented potential, development, evolution. They were measured repeatedly over time, changes recorded, growth observed, as if their lives were experiments. Some children died between measurements. Their final entry was a line, a date, a conclusion. The archive outlives the cage. Years passed, exhibits closed, fences were removed, but the records remained, stored, catalogued, preserved. Museums kept them, universities referenced them, scholars cited them, long after the people themselves were gone. The archive spoke louder than the absence. Erasure through preservation. Ironically, preservation caused erasure, because the more the records were used, the less anyone questioned how they were created. The violence was invisible, wrapped in professionalism, clean handwriting, official stamps. What was preserved was not suffering, but justification. Silence in the footnotes. Later historians would reference these materials briefly, as context, as background, rarely as atrocity. The focus shifted to colonial administration, economic outcomes, political consequences. The human exhibits became footnotes, mentioned, then passed over. Forgotten does not mean lost. The images still exist. Some are digitized, some are locked away, some are displayed without explanation. A face stares out from the past, expression neutral, eyes forward. The person is unnamed, but they are watching, waiting. for acknowledgement. History remembers what it finds useful and forgets what demands accountability.
Deaths that were expected. Death did not surprise anyone. That is the most disturbing part. It was anticipated, prepared for, quietly accepted. Bodies that were never meant to survive. The people inside the Antwerp Zoo enclosure were not meant to thrive. They were meant to exist long enough to be observed, long enough to be documented, long enough to justify the display. European climate alone ensured suffering. Cold air damaged lungs unfamiliar with it. Damp ground weakened joints. Poor nutrition eroded strength. Illness was not an anomaly. It was part of the system. Disease moves faster than sympathy. Coughs spread quickly. Fevers followed. Children weakened first, then the elderly, then those already exhausted by travel. Medical intervention was minimal. Doctors visited occasionally, not to heal, but to observe, to record progression, to note outcomes. Treatment would interfere with authenticity. Hunger as an unwritten rule. Food was provided, but not enough. Rations were designed to sustain appearance, not health. Malnutrition became visible. Ribs showed. Faces hollowed. Energy faded. Visitors noticed. Some commented. Few questioned. Because hunger was expected. In their minds, this was how these people lived. Death without ceremony. When someone died, there were no rituals, no mourning period, no closure. The body was removed quietly, often early in the morning, sometimes after closing hours. The exhibit did not pause. Visitors arrived as scheduled. Children pointed as usual. The space where someone once stood was simply empty. Records reduce life to lines. Deaths were recorded briefly. A date, a presumed cause, exposure, weak constitution, natural decline. Language softened reality. The enclosure was never mentioned. Responsibility was never assigned. The system remained untouched. Parents who were expected to continue. Parents were rarely excused from display after losing a child. Grief disrupted the exhibit. Sorrow was not educational. Mothers were expected to continue daily routines. Fathers were expected to perform. Their pain was irrelevant to the schedule. Some complied. Others withdrew into silence. Both responses were ignored. When death became invisible. As deaths accumulated, they became unremarkable. Zoo staff adjusted routines. Researchers updated notes. Administrators refined logistics. Loss was normalized. And once normalized, it no longer shocked. The visitor's role. Visitors noticed absences. A child no longer present. A woman no longer visible. But few asked questions. They assumed change, replacement, rotation. They moved on, because curiosity did not extend to accountability. Unmarked endings. Burials, when they occurred, were quiet, unmarked, unrecorded. Some bodies were returned, some were not. Documentation is incomplete, which is another way of saying they did not matter enough to track. Death as confirmation. For those who believed in racial hierarchy, death was proof of weakness,
proof of inferiority, proof that the exhibit was justified. This belief protected them from guilt, because if death was inevitable, then no one was responsible. But inevitability is a lie. Death was not fate. It was design. The weight of expected loss. To expect death is to accept it. To accept it is to allow it. And once allowed, it repeats, quietly, efficiently, without resistance.
Belgium, Leopold II, and denial. The Antwerp Zoo did not exist in isolation. It was a symptom, a reflection of something much larger, an empire that believed ownership extended to human lives. The king who owned a country. King Leopold II of Belgium did not rule the Congo. He owned it. The Congo Free State was his personal property, not accountable to Parliament, not accountable to law, only to profit. Millions were forced into labor. Rubber quotas were enforced through violence. Hands were severed as punishment. Families were held hostage to ensure compliance. This was not rumor. It was documented. Distance as strategy. Belgium itself remained clean, civilized, polite. The brutality occurred far away, out of sight, out of conscience. Back home, newspapers praised economic growth. Museums displayed trophies. Zoos displayed people. All evidence of empire's reach without showing its cost. The zoo as a sanitized atrocity. The human exhibits allowed Belgians to see the Congo without blood, without screams, without accountability. They saw smiling faces, constructed villages, controlled narratives. This was empire without guilt, violence stripped of context, suffering curated for comfort. Scientific approval. Leopold's empire relied on science for legitimacy. Anthropologists classified Congolese bodies. Doctors published findings. Institutions endorsed conclusions. The zoo provided data. Data provided justification. Justification provided silence. The language of civilization. Officials spoke of uplift, education, progress. They framed exploitation as guidance, control as protection, domination as benevolence. The zoo reinforced this story. Visitors saw people learning civilization, never people being destroyed by it. Denial as national identity. When reports of Congo atrocities reached Europe, Belgium resisted. Officials dismissed them as exaggerations, foreign propaganda, misunderstandings. The zoo became evidence against critics. Look, they said, these people are fine. The exhibit lied on behalf of empire. The cost of admitting truth. Acknowledgement would require guilt. Guilt would require responsibility. Responsibility would require change. So denial persisted. Not loud denial, quiet denial, administrative denial, the most effective kind. Monuments and memory. Leopold II's statues still stood for decades, his name honored, his legacy sanitized. The victims remained unnamed, unmarked, unacknowledged. The zoo never publicly apologized because apology would imply wrongdoing, and wrongdoing threatened the narrative. Empire ends and silence remains. Eventually, Leopold lost control of the Congo. International pressure forced change, but the mindset endured. The zoo closed its human exhibits, not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer fashionable, and silence filled the space where accountability should have been. Empires rarely collapse from guilt. They fade, leaving denial behind.
How history erased them.
History does not forget on its own. Forgetting takes effort. It requires decisions, edits, omissions. And in the case of the Antwerp Zoo human exhibits, erasure was deliberate. When the fences came down. There was no announcement, no apology, no final notice. The human exhibits simply ended. The fences were dismantled, the structures removed, the ground repurposed. Visitors continued walking the same paths. Most never noticed anything had changed, because nothing visible remained. Records that quietly disappeared. Some documents were archived, others were misplaced, some were destroyed. Language in official records shifted. Human exhibits became ethnographic displays. Subjects became participants. Deaths were reframed as health complications. The truth was softened until it barely resembled itself. Museums without context. Photographs remained. Objects remained, but explanations did not. Images were displayed without names. Artifacts were shown without stories. Visitors saw culture, not captivity. They learned about traditions, not trauma. This absence of context completed the erasure. Academic silence. Historians moved on. New topics emerged. Colonial exhibitions became footnotes, mentioned briefly, analyzed abstractly, rarely confronted morally. The suffering was inconvenient. It complicated narratives of progress, so it was minimized. The language of neutrality. Neutral language became a shield, of their time, culturally accepted, historically complex. These phrases created distance. They excused cruelty by normalizing it. They allowed people to discuss horror without feeling responsible. Neutrality erased victims more efficiently than denial. No names, no descendants, no respect. Most individuals from the Antwerp Zoo exhibits cannot be traced. No family records, no descendants acknowledged, no memorials erected. Without names, memory collapses. Without memory, injustice feels abstract, and abstraction protects institutions. Public memory chooses comfort. Belgium remembers architecture, industry, art, but not cages, not fences, not children being watched while they slept. Because remembrance is selective, and societies remember what allows them to sleep at night. Silence as success. From an administrative perspective, erasure worked. The zoo remained respected. The city thrived. The nation moved forward. The victims vanished. This is how systems protect themselves. They wait. They soften language. They allow time to bury discomfort. The consequence of forgetting. When history erases suffering, it invites repetition, because lessons unlearned are lessons repeated. Different victims, different justifications, same structure. The cage changes shape, but it never disappears. Erasure is not passive. It is maintenance. What remains unsaid? There is no plaque at the Antwerp Zoo marking where people were displayed. No official memorial. No names etched into stone. Only silence. And silence is not neutral. It takes sides. Modern zoos and uncomfortable questions. The fences are gone. The artificial huts have been replaced. Visitors today wander paths lined with flowers, signage, and enclosures filled with animals. The human exhibits are gone, but the questions remain. Seeing the past in present spaces. When you walk through a zoo, do you notice the lines of cages? Do you notice the deliberate staging, the separation between observer and observed? Even now, the architecture reflects a desire for control. Animals are enclosed for observation. Curiosity is normalized. The gaze is curated. It is easy to imagine the same gaze once directed at people. Entertainment or education? Modern zoos claim education, conservation, research, but the lines are blurry. We watch, we judge, we consume lives as spectacle. Even when the subjects are not human, the act of observation raises ethical questions. Do we ever truly respect the autonomy of those observed? Or do we simply demand performance to satisfy curiosity? The shadow of history. The Antwerp Zoo is no longer a human exhibit. The fences are gone, but the questions linger. Every visitor carries them unknowingly. Every child, parent, researcher, observer participates in a continuum of watching. The faint memory of injustice whispers, "Do you notice? Do you care? Will you question what is presented as normal?" History does not need us to remember every detail. It asks only that we feel, that we notice, that we acknowledge. Because acknowledgement is the first step to preventing repetition.
The cage never really disappeared. The fences were dismantled. The artificial huts were removed. The human exhibits ended. But the cage never really disappeared. Invisible fences. Look around you. Every society builds fences. Not always iron. Sometimes they are invisible. Rules, customs, expectations. When we stop noticing, the fences grow stronger. In Antwerp, the physical fence is gone, but the psychological one, the one that separates empathy from indifference, remains. It exists whenever we normalize cruelty, whenever we observe without consequence, whenever we allow entertainment to mask injustice. History as a cage. The victims of the Antwerp Zoo were erased physically, socially, and morally. Yet the echoes of their suffering remain, in archives, in photographs, in the spaces where no one dares to remember. History did not free them. It locked them inside abstraction, a cage built not of wood or metal, but of silence and forgetting. Recognition as liberation. Acknowledgement is the key, even decades later, even centuries later. Naming the victims, remembering their stories, reading the records, understanding the pain they endured. Recognition dismantles the invisible bars. It allows memory to breathe. It prevents history from repeating itself. The modern observer.
We are all observers now, watching, learning, recording, even telling stories like this. The responsibility lies in how we watch. Do we see faces or just performance? Do we see suffering or just spectacle? Do we see humanity or do we close our eyes? Reflection on human nature. The Antwerp Zoo reminds us of the capacity for normalized cruelty, that ordinary people in ordinary places can witness horror without acting, that empathy can be suspended for convenience, that injustice can be curated into a form of entertainment. And if we forget this lesson, we invite repetition. The cage may take another form, another era, another victim. The silent witnesses. Children, mothers, fathers, families brought from the Congo. They existed, they suffered, they were seen, and yet they were forgotten. We must not forget. Their gaze remains in photographs, in archives, in memory. The fence was removed. The huts were dismantled. The human exhibits ended. But the lessons remain. History is not neutral. Observation is not neutral. Silence is not neutral. The cage is always present where empathy is absent. This channel exists to remember what history tried to bury, to tell the stories that were erased, to feel what was once silenced. If this story disturbed you, it was meant to, because discomfort is the first step toward awareness, because acknowledgement is the first step toward change. Thank you for watching. And remember, the cages of the past are only broken if we see them.